Let's start with the presentation. First of all, I would like to go into why we do this again. And yeah, it's, as I said, it's a contested issue in economics, the relationship between the government size and economic growth. And first of all, I would like to talk a little about the theoretical prediction. I think it's best based in endogenous growth theory by a Barrow paper in 1919 published. And according to this paper, we have a nonlinear inverted U-shaped functional relationship between the ratio of government expenditure to GDP and the growth rate of GDP per capita. And this is also sometimes dubbed as the army curve. And the growth optimal size of government is achieved if the marginal productivity of public inputs is just offset by the marginal distortionary effect of income taxation in the Barrow model. However, what is a little bit astonishing that we do not have so much evidence on the nonlinear hypotheses. The vast majority of studies deal with the linear model actually. So they test if there's a negative or positive correlation between these two. However, as it is to be expected for this topic, the empirical evidence is quite inconclusive, which can be shown by recent surveys. For example, Gammon and Au in 2013 draw up a survey and conduct a survey, and they come to the conclusion that more or less positive effects of the productive public expenditure and taxation effects more or less compensate each other. And there were also some more recent studies, a meta-analysis by Churchill et al. And others. This is a kind of systematic survey, I would say, and a small survey by Beck and Earl, who come to the conclusion that overall we have a systematic negative correlation between these two variables. However, these overall results might be somewhat misleading because they hide details like the heterogeneity between the studies, and there are also some econometric problems as well. And endogeneity bias is prevalent. We have, in all likelihood, reverse causality also as an issue because low growth causes high public expenditure due to automatic stabilizers. We all know this. Even if we try to smooth it out, we cannot be sure that we really smooth it out by averaging the data. Moreover, also what is interesting to know is if we carry out IV regression, instrumental variable regressions, then we find evidence for a positive causal relationship that runs from government size to economic growth. And what is also interesting to know is maybe that these surveys the results of these surveys are much strongly driven by outdated cross-country studies. And panel data regressions, which are now the standard approach to analyze this relationship, average data by a minimum of 5 years do not find any evidence for a systematic relationship. And moreover, I would like to mention that the survey by Berg and Earn rests on a rather quiet sample of 7 studies, of which 2 reach different conclusions. So I think this paper, and as I've shown in a 2015 comment in the Journal of Economic Service, that this paper has a paper selection bias, for example. What is at first sight at least somewhat confusing is that the empirical literature applies a whole range of measures for government size. This range from public consumption as a ratio to GDP, to general government expenditure as a ratio to GDP, or tax revenues as a ratio to GDP, but also central government expenditure or subnational government expenditure as a ratio to GDP. So you have a whole range of different measures there in these studies, which might also account for the different results. Now, what is our contribution to the literature? The literature mainly concentrates on post-World War II period, and we we use a historical panel data set of 17 OECD countries with a long range from 1880 to 2016. So we have quite a unique feature because we have a long time dimension, and also the risk of a possibly nickel bias is reduced by this study. But what is more interesting about our data set, it enables us to run a kind, as I would like to emphasize, a kind of natural experience, because we see changing economic policy paradigms over times, and these paradigms define the role and also the size of government. This is at least our hypothesis, and from our data sets, we see also what is maybe also not astonishing, rather clear pattern that suggests that we have smaller governments before World War II and bigger governments after World War II. Moreover, we can make a contribution to testing the nonlinear hypothesis, and we use two measures for government size. In our historical data set, we have only available central government expenditure as a measure for government size, and therefore we carry out a kind of sensitivity analysis with respect to general government expenditure from 1960 to 2016. This brings me to the next slide, and here I would like just to explain a little bit more in detail why we think that we can use the central government expenditure as a measure of government size. And the blue line shown in figure 1 shows annual cross-country averages of the central government expenditure to GDP, while the red line shows general government expenditure to GDP for the small sample for the data available. And what we clearly see is, what is also not very surprising, is that before World War II, we have smaller government at, on average, 10% of GDP, and after World War II, we see government, first of all, has a rapid increase between the mid of the 1950s till the mid of the 1980s. And on average, this corresponds to 23% of GDP. And one can very well argue that the central government level bears the main responsible for the biggest peacetime increase from 1955 to 1983, because there's a build-up of the welfare state on the one hand, and then due to the Keynesian revolution after World War II, the fiscal policy gained an active role, became a toolkit of the government, of the central government, and also, for example, during the World War II, defense spending increased, and also public transport infrastructure, in particular in the 1960s and 1970s, was expanded as well. And we have a strong correlation for the time from the 1970s to 2016 between central and general government expenditure, which amounts to about 90%. And also the variation of general government expenditure can be largely explained by the variation in central government expenditure. Now, this leads me to the empirical approach we use in order to estimate the impact of government size on economic growth. So we use a standard fixed effects model with country and time fixed effects to account for unobserved heterogeneity. And we use standard errors that are robust to autocorrelation, to heteroscedasticity, and so to cross-sectional dependence as well. In equation 1, our estimation, our regression estimation is shown on the left-hand side. You see the first differences of real GDP per capita in natural logarithms. On the right-hand side, the first term is the initial, it's a proxy to capture the conditional convergence. And the second term is the one of interest. It's the coefficient beta for the proxy for government size, for the measure of government size, which is central government expenditure to GDP for the historical data set, and for the small one, general government expenditure to GDP. And in order to care for reverse causality issues, we lag this variable by 5 years, because we use for all continuous variables in our estimation, we use 5-year moving averages in order to smooth out shorter term business cycle effects. At least we try to smooth out these effects. And then the third term on the right-hand side is matrix X, which includes various macroeconomic variables, such as the investment to GDP ratio, and also for monetary policy indicators as well, inflation rate and the interest rate. And moreover, we have included a term for financial crisis, a dummy, small d, and then the TR in the second line of the equation represents unobserved time varying country-specific effects. It's a term for the country-specific trends, literally. And so let me tell you something about our testing strategy. So in essence, we test 3 different models, the 3 different sets of exogenous variables, but I only present the full model here, the general model in this presentation. And we try to analyze the difference between small and big government by splitting the sample in the pre and post-World War II period. And we use, as I already said, 5-year moving averages, and we test a linear relationship, and we add in the nonlinear model a quadratic term for government size. And we run a robustness test with respect to general government expenditure, as already said. And the last thing is about caring for individual heterogeneity, but which is not the emphasis in this presentation. Now, we have carried out for our regression analysis 2 kinds of regression analysis. I would say this is a kind of pre-regression analysis we do here. We use a polynomial regression smoother in order to learn something about the raw relationship between government size and GDP per capita growth. Thus, we have not included any clustering of the data here, just the raw data. And what is interesting about this smoother is the fact that we do not have to make a prior assumption on the functional relationship, and it's a non-parametric approach. So we do not have to make an assumption about the distribution of the data, and we can, so to say, let the data speak. But however, we have to make an assumption of the degree of the polynomial in advance. And so we have made 2 assumptions. The first one is what we call linear smoother. We assume a polynomial of degree 1. And the second one is a quadratic smoother, for which we assume a polynomial of degree 2. And now I will turn first of all to the results for the linear smoother. And what we see here is that for all 3 samples shown in figure 2, in all 3 panels, we see that there is a rather weak correlation between government size and the growth rate of GDP per capita. If it suggests anything, if at all, then if you look at panel B, there's a slight positive correlation. But yeah, that's really okay. You see that there is a positive linear regression, but it's still it's rather weak from our point of view. However, if we turn now to the quadratic smoother, we can see the following. For the pre-World War II period, it's almost the same like the linear smoother. So it's a kind of confirmation of this relationship. But with respect to the sample after World War II, and the full sample, which seems to be driven by the results of the sample after World War II, there we see a nonlinear relationship, but not the one we would expect from endogenous theory. it is just the opposite of that. So it's rather puzzling. And therefore, we looked a little bit closer at the data, and we find that there were some really extreme outlying observations with respect to central government expenditure to GDP ratios, which amounted to above 50% and even reaching 100%. And this was just after World War II, a few observations in the Netherlands and also in the United Kingdom. They bear the responsibility for this. And if we exclude these outlying observations, then indeed the quadratic smoother becomes very similar again to the linear smoother, which supports our main hypothesis that we do not have a very strong correlation between these two variables. Now let us turn to the results of our two-way fixed effects models. And as I already told you, we have it, we estimate the data for 3 different samples and for the linear and non-linear model. And I would like to turn your attention to the yellow shaded area. This is the linear term of the central government to GDP ratio and the quadratic term. And if we look at the linear model across the different samples, then pretty much the same result. We arrive at pretty much the same result as for the smoother analysis. So yeah, so this result is further, so these estimations then further support for the hypothesis that we do not have a close correlation between these two variables. But with regard to the nonlinear model, it's something like it's more inconclusive. The results are more inconclusive because for the full sample and also for pre-World War II, we cannot estimate any, we cannot confirm any nonlinear relationship between government size and economic growth. But for the post-World War II, we can establish, or the estimations at least establish, a nonlinear relationship. But again, the puzzling one. So we have again this puzzling relationship, and we think this is due to the fact that we have a strong. We have in the first decade after World War II, we have a strong decrease in the central government to GDP ratio. And then afterwards, it increases and it stabilizes from the 1980s onwards. And so this might be a reason why we have such a peculiar or strange relationship estimated here. And this can be corroborated by the small sample regressions. Now let us turn to the small sample regressions, which range from 1960 to 2016, and we carry out the same smoother analysis as for the historical data set, this time with regard to general expenditure, to the relationship between general government expenditure and the per capita growth rate of GDP, and with central government expenditure as well. And if we look now at panel E, we find a loose relationship for general government expenditure for expenditure to GDP ratios between 30% and 60% to GDP, with the GDP per capita growth. For the linear and quadratic smoother, they are very similar. But at the margins, we have, again, quite puzzling results. In particular, we see if the threshold of 60% to GDP is if the general government expenditure to GDP is above this threshold, then GDP per capita should increase with government size, which is quite a puzzling result. And the other one at the other margin, at the lower margin, we see also the same. If the government expenditure to GDP ratio rises, then essentially the GDP growth decreases at the lower end, which is also quite a puzzling result. And we think this is due to the low local density of observations, because it's the smoother is essentially a local regression. And the results for the central government expenditure, if you have a look at panel B of figure 3, then you see it essentially corroborates the results for the general government expenditure in this range between 30% and 60% of GDP. And this is further confirmed by our regression results with the two-way fixed effects model. We see for the linear model and also for the nonlinear model, in this case, very clear results. Government size exerts, according to this model, a positive impact, a statistically positive impact on economic growth. But this is a quite modest one, because you see we have coefficients of the size of 0.05, which means that a 1 percentage point increase in the government expenditure to GDP ratio would accelerate GDP per capita growth by 0.04 percentage points, which is rather a minor increase. It's not so relevant, I would say. And if we look at the nonlinear regression, we do not find any systematic nonlinear relationship between these two variables. Now, let me stress, I come now to the conclusions of my paper. And now something does not, I'm sorry. Yep. The conclusions of my paper, I'm sorry for this. That's not, for the, now I have found the right slide. I'm sorry about this. So I come to the conclusion. What I like to stress is that this is essentially, this is work in progress. I forgot to tell you, and these are preliminary results. So now, based on this preliminary results, we draw the following conclusion. Overall, in peacetime, government size has not reached a level that is growth hindering. The prediction of endogenous growth model is not corroborated, but that does not mean that no tipping point of government size at a slightly larger government size might exist. On average, we have across countries, we have in our sample an average size of 50% to GDP after work for the general government expenditure. And it seems to be, while small government does not affect economic, big government can exert a small positive impact. That might be due to proactive public expenditure, but this might be also due to fiscal policies in special circumstances, such as hysteresis might play a role. And according to our historical data set, we find no evidence for a systematic relationship between government size and economic growth. And yeah, as I said, the small sample provide evidence for a small positive significant evidence. And what our analyst has so far suggested to this point, up to this point, is that the growth relevance of government size is overrated in the literature, we think. And we would advise policymakers paying closer attention how to run government affairs efficiently and to care for a high quality of government functions. And I think future research, or we think, should focus on the decomposition of government expenditure, because it's a dimension for the quality of government services, government provision, and the governance structure of the public sector is more important than to try to come up with a stable relationship between government size of economic growth. And also our result that we do not find any systematic relationship might be also due to the fact that that there is no stable relationship, but also for sure individual heterogeneity might play also a role for this result. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you very much for your attention.
You are just on time. I mean, I didn't want to intervene because I saw that you are like finishing, so I didn't notify you that you have 5 minutes. Just on time.
Just on time. So that's perfect. I'm happy.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Carsten, for the very nice talk and the discussion of your paper. So I have several points to make. It's mostly a matter of. Okay, so what we are going to do, I'm going to make my several points, and then the audience would be able to ask questions. Is that okay with you?
This is okay. That's fine with me.
Okay. So my point of view is the whole issue of the relationship between government size and economic growth is like methodologically. I think that okay, I would have tackled it in a different way. Rather than like using panel data, I would have since you have really a very nice long time series, I would have used, instead of panel data, I would have used really time series, like case studies for the 17 countries that you took, and then try from there to really to see if you can make like across the board conclusions. This is my
I see your point. Yeah,
a much better approach. But this is, again, it's a matter of, I mean, there are many, of course, methods to tackle the same question. But since you have really an asset, which is the long time series, then you have to utilize that, I guess.
Yeah. Okay.
We would prefer panel data when the time element is really short, rather short. But here you have really long, very long, extremely long, even, time span. So this is my what I would have done if I had to do it. Okay, this is the first thing, and I will elaborate on this. Also, what methods can be used with that. But the first, I mean, the other thing that I would have, and you didn't, I guess you didn't emphasize that the conclusions also can vary based on the types of government expenditures that you are taking. Instead of like taking the aggregated government expenditure or spending, I, for instance, I did some work on like splitting the government expenditures into civilian and military, for instance, or like tackling infrastructure versus like other types of maybe, I don't know, either productive or non-productive like activities of government. You can also split it this way, this also worth like being done. I don't know, with your database you cannot do it most probably, because it's just the aggregated central government expenditures. So you will not be able to do it with that. But with other, I guess OECD database has some like splitting of government expenditures into the various outlays. So maybe this is worth being done. Another thing that you tackle, and it is extremely nice what you did, you tackled the issue of non-linearity, which is, it's very common in economics that, okay, almost any relationship that you say, okay, who said that it is like a linear relationship? Let's see, maybe it is a U-shaped, inverted U-shaped, and of course it is very useful to do it this way. The point is, since you took really panel data, if you had taken like time series instead, you look at another dimension of basically of non-linearity. You can look like for each country, of course, over time, what happens to the relationship between government size and growth. Okay, it can be done this way. Again, this is like the advantages of using time series. Okay, now how I would have done it with time series. There are many really useful methods. On one, Roland will elaborate later on. One of them is using ARDL. You can use, basically find the long run relationship between the two variables, between government size and economic growth, and see see the relationship, either positive, negative. You can also use nonlinearity there. So it's not only, you can do it this way too. And there's even panel data ARDL. If you insist on panel data, then you can use panel data ARDL. But it's not the only method. Also, you can use, this is what I'm going to do also in my talk, use single equation co-integration methods. You have fully modified OLS, you have CCR, canonical co-integration regression, you have dynamic OLS. You can use all of these. And my favorite is a method by Toda and Yamamoto from 1995. Also, I used it a lot in my research, in which basically you augment the var, okay? You augment the var, and then you can basically test for causality, for causality between the variables. Okay, you have like two endogenous variables. All these methods, the advantage that you don't have any problem of indigeneity, because in all these methods, all the variables, both variables of U are indigenous. So, I mean, you don't have to worry about indigeneity. Okay, the last thing that I would, I guess, I don't know, maybe you have some possible typos in your paper. For instance, in table 1 in your paper, do you have it in front of you? I don't know if you guys have the paper, but he sent it to us. We don't hear you. I guess you are on mute. Carsten.
I'm sorry. Yes, I am. Now it's better. You hear me?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So, yeah. I have the paper in front of me now.
Yeah. So, for instance, on column 4, the coefficient of the central public outlays, I think it is according, unless you had like a rounding, which is not really good enough. According to my understanding, this is supposed to be a negative and significant coefficient. It is the coefficient.
Yeah. You're right. Definitely, this is a typo.
So this is a little changes the results, because then you see that you still have a negative relationship and significant negative relationship.
Yeah, we have still there. That's right. But this vanishes if we include further variables. This is the point. Okay. Yeah. But this is true.
Just check if it is really a typo, or it is just a, maybe I thought that maybe you just rounded up. It wasn't like significant, and you rounded up like the coefficient, and rounded down maybe the standard deviation, and then you ended up with this, which is supposedly T of 2.5, which is supposed to be significant, but it's not, according to the.
No, it's really significant. You are right. It's really a typo. I'm sorry about this.
Okay, that's all what I have.
Okay.
And now we open the floor for your.
Should I respond directly or wait for the other?
I guess you respond, and then others can ask.
I think yes. I have only to. I can only say that I agree with you. We should really make use of this long time dimension for our sample, and it would be a good starter to carry out a time series analysis. And I thank you very much for your very insightful comments regarding the time series approach, and I think it would be very valuable to move onwards with a time series approach, in particular based on the results we have reached so far, because I think the results point that maybe heterogeneity across countries might be an issue here, and as you stressed, you can improve the improve to estimating the nonlinear relationship in particular. This is really better done in a time series analysis. And thank you very much for your proposals. And maybe a panel data ARDL might be also a possibility for us to move forward. This is something like a how to say, a first start, how to cope with this long, really historical data set. But we found it very interesting. We had also some worries regarding the measure of government size, but in the end, we could calm ourselves a little bit if we looked at the literature, so that different measures of government size can be used, but one has to explain it to the audience which government size is assumed in the regressions and why we do this. And so we tried at least to do this in this preliminary draft. And yeah, I'm happy that at least you find the research question quite interesting, although the econometric method is not the first best method maybe for this data set. And we agree with you, and we have also talked about it internally in our discussions with my co-author about this issue, how to tackle this problem. But it was also, to be honest, a little bit a matter of time constraint as well. So
yeah, okay.
Thank you so much.
And now, I mean, I open the floor for our audience if they have questions, if they have like comments.
I just wanted to add, and it's just, you know, I'm not a statistician, and but when you're looking at it, and I thought it was very interesting, looking at the types of expenditures, specific country and types of expenditures, could that be easily done as suggested maybe with time series?
Yeah, I mean, if you have, excuse me, Carsten, since I also done some work with this, yeah, I mean, the best would be, of course, if you can take every country and can like disaggregate the government spending into the outlays, the different outlays. That's the best, because you can say, okay, let's say, let's say education spending versus health spending. Now with the COVID-19, you could say, okay, yeah, I mean, the country better maybe spend, when they spend more on health, could be that, I mean, the country is growing faster, let's say. So,
and would it be easily possible to add other data sets? And I don't know if the US would be available to that. Would that be easy to look at in contrast with the OECDs or some specific countries?
So just to add to the answer by Arma, I guess that if you decompose government expenditure by, for example, function, that would be the interesting decomposition, I guess. Then it gets a little bit more difficult with regard to the data availability. That's natural. But I think for the United States, there might be also long time series available for the United States. I'm not sure. That would be interesting. Surely, if we switch to a time series analysis, then it would be perfectly possible to enlarge the data set for single countries if data is available, and also to decompose it, because we think also that's essential question to analyze the relationship between economic performance and government expenditure by a decomposition of government functions. That's really the interesting part, I guess, because because you add up many different things into one unit, into one aggregate, and that makes it also difficult to find something like a systematic correlation. I guess that's a problem, but it has been done in the literature, because it's a very, very crucial question for economics, how much the government should be involved or should intervene in the market economy. And so that is the question behind it. And therefore, it has really gained a lot of interest in the profession.
Yeah,
But,
it's a very contemporary question in the U.S. as well as elsewhere, of course, but in particular in the U.S. So from a social and a political perspective, I think it could be very informative.
I think so too. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Carsten. Any other questions? Okay, then we are moving to our second presenter. That would be William Hauk from University of South Carolina. He will talk about human capital and economic growth.
Okay, so thank you, everyone. And let's see. All right, usual question. Everybody's seen my slides and so forth? My title page here? Okay.
Yes.
Excellent. All right, so welcome and thank you, everybody, for being here. This builds maybe a little bit on some of what we just saw in the previous presentation in terms of looking at sort of econometric specifications of economic growth. This is something I've been working on a little bit ever since I was assigned a project in graduate school. And, you know, the idea is that measuring the impact of human capital accumulation in an economic growth regression setting is kind of a difficult proposition. And there's a few reasons for this. Intuitively, we would tend to think that human capital investments in education and so forth would be a good thing for economic growth. Yet, there's a relatively large literature that finds that when you do human capital variables in growth regression settings, especially in sort of a panel data setting, which we'll get to in a minute, it finds that human capital variables frequently either have, you know, insignificant or sometimes even negative coefficients when they enter into growth regression. So there's, you know, several papers. These were just a few that I pulled out of the 1990s, and this continues even well into the 2000s. So looking at trying to think about some of the reasons why this might be the case. Well, first one is that, you know, human capital, it's kind of a vague concept. It's an inherently difficult concept to adequately capture empirically, and it's almost certainly going to be measured with error. So there's several papers that have looked at this, including one that I wrote with Roman Vaxiarg about 10 years ago. And I think this problem becomes exacerbated when we move into a panel data setting, especially when there's lots of fixed effects terms, because these measures tend to be, they're typically relatively persistent within countries and across time. The idea being that if you have a variable that has, you know, a certain signal to it and a certain amount of measurement error to it, and the signal is relatively persistent, well, you know, you do a fixed effect in a regression, that's going to take away most of the signal and just kind of leave you with a lot of measurement error. And so, you know, weird things start happening when you do that. Second reason is that, and it's kind of related to the first, is that there's a lot of different ways we can measure human capital. So the data set that gets used a lot in these studies is the one put together by Barrow and Lee. Most recent edition was 2013. And it's got, you know, 11 different measures of educational attainment that are broken into male and female categories, and it's 146 countries measured at 5-year intervals. Okay, well, which one of those should we use? Possibly several of them. I don't know, it's a difficult question. Okay. So, well, we're going to look at this in the context of solo style growth regression. So this is one that, you know, some people in this panel might be familiar with, but I'll kind of go through it real quickly. is that there's this paper going back to Mankiw, Romer, and Weil that showed that the main predictions of the solo growth model can be log linearized such that you get kind of this equation right here. But basically, what we're looking at is we start off with a Cobb-Douglas production function, throw in a steady state conditional convergence, all the stuff that's in the solo model. And we get that you can do a log linear specification such that you've got growth as being a function of human capital savings, physical capital savings, that's the log SKI there, human capital savings, log SHI, population depreciation, technological growth, that's the NDG there, a lagged income term to represent convergence. And then you've got, and this is what we'll focus on a little bit here, are these two productivity terms at the end. There's a measure of initial total factor productivity, log AI at the beginning of the time period measured, and then this growth term, growth and productivity, which is a function of the time that passes. You can do this both for human capital savings specification, basically looking at educational enrollment, or human capital attainment specification, that's the second equation here, looking at the total educational level that people in a society have. Okay. So, what Mankiw, Romer, and Weil do is they derive this structural specification. Here's the reduced form version of it. You've got log linear regression based on human physical capital savings, human capital savings, population growth, convergence, and so forth. Now, what Mankiw, Romer, and Weil do is they're basically doing a cross-sectional regression. So they've got a few different samples, but they've got, I think in their paper, it was a cross-section of growth from 1960 to 1985 in a number of countries. And this is a cross-sectional specification. Okay. Now, kind of implicit in this cross-sectional specification that Mankiw, Romer, and Weil did is that there's this assumption that the labor productivity terms, that log AI 0 term and the growth term, that G term that was in on the previous slide, that they're uncorrelated with the regressors. If you just got this residual term epsilon I, and that's going to be uncorrelated with all the other regressors. Probably a relatively heroic assumption in that case. Okay, so what happens? Well, kind of the next step of this. So actually, here's my attempt to just update their analysis with newer data. And there's a couple different specifications that I do. First is, so the implied lambda in here, I've got the reduced form tables in the paper, but I'm just going to walk through the implied structural parameters that you back out of the estimation in this presentation. You've got relatively slow convergence if you don't use human capital in your regression, if you just use physical capital. So the lambda term is the implied convergence rate, so it's less than 1% convergence rate to steady state if you only use physical capital in your steady state. On the other hand, physical capital savings does account for huge variation in growth rates across countries. So 75% elasticity if you take that number seriously. You throw in human capital savings. That was specification 4 in my reduced form table. Human capital savings adds, first of all, quite a bit to good distance fit. It speeds up the rate of convergence to about 2.5%. Takes away a lot of the effective physical capital savings, goes down to 16%. If you specify human capital in levels, that's in column 6. Then the implied beta parameter, that's the supposedly the elasticity of human capital. It goes up quite a bit to almost 75%. The alpha term goes up to, the elasticity goes up to 48%. Convergence rates is pretty close to 2%. Little uncomfortable with these results in the sense that if you take the solo growth model seriously, the alpha and beta parameters should not add up to more than 1, because effectively what you're saying is, the alpha in the solo growth model, that's going to be the share of income attributed to physical capital. Beta should be the share of capital, the share of income attributed to human capital, skilled labor, if you like. And then 1 minus alpha minus beta should be the share of income attributable to less skilled labor. Well, obviously, if alpha and beta are greater than 1, suddenly labor's share of income becomes negative. So little uncomfortable with those results. But there are, kind of econometric problems with just doing a pure cross-sectional regression. So that's why kind of the next step in this literature was done by Nazrul Islam, and a lot of subsequent papers have kind of followed this, in that he assumes that, that residual term in the cross-sectional regression, the assumptions are unlikely to be satisfied. So he goes instead for a two-way fixed effects panel specification, breaking it into 5-year intervals, again, kind of to keep us from capturing, business cycle fluctuations and so forth, as we mentioned in the previous presentation. And there's basically going to be a time fixed effect, eta t, which is, so that's the time fixed effect, and then a country fixed effect, mu I. And the eta is going to calculate the growth in productivity from the structural specification, and the mu I, the country fixed effect, is going to capture the initial level of total factor productivity, the AI0 term from the structural specification. And again, the fixed effect captures log AI0, the period fixed effect, the time fixed effect captures that G times T, all that mess there. Now, the problem I see with doing these two-way fixed effect specifications, they follow very nicely from the structural model, but the problem I mentioned earlier is that some of these variables, they're very persistent across time within countries. They're highly correlated across countries within a time period and so forth. You do these two-way fixed effect specification, sometimes there's relatively little variation remaining in some of these variables, and a lot of the variation that's left is likely to be attributable to measurement error. Okay, so I think this causes some of the econometric problems you're going to see in the next slide, which is that here's what happens when we do the same specification, only with the same regression, only with the panel data two-way fixed effect specification. First off, the convergence rate to the steady state, the implied lambda across all specifications bumps up quite a bit. So it's now kind of more in the range of like 4 to 5%, depending on the specification that you use. The coefficient on physical capital savings, it's a bit slower, but it's probably a little bit more in line with some of the more theoretical calibrated results, which show that physical capital savings should probably be attributable to about 1/3 of national income. But I think the most interesting, so that's the alpha parameter. The most interesting results here happen with the beta parameter, the coefficient on human capital. And in the savings specification, that's column 4, human capital savings measured as school enrollment ratio. I think in the Islam specification, it's the secondary school enrollment ratio. The coefficient becomes negative, and it's fairly significant. with the human capital level, so just measuring educational attainment, the coefficient is still negative. It's insignificant, statistically insignificant. This is for the data that I had, but this is kind of in line both with what was in Islam's paper and several subsequent analyses that use the two-way fixed effect specification. So that human capital either vanishes or it actually becomes somewhat negatively associated with economic growth, which just seems like a less than satisfying result. Okay, so I think, this two-way, the period fixed effects, this is actually something I kind of came across when I did an error when I was coding error when I was doing a regression in a previous paper. But adding the period fixed effects really seems to be driving some of the weird results in this fixed effect specification. Now, I think the nice thing is that I don't know that we really need period fixed effects. Why? Because a lot of the recent versions of the Penn World Tables, which is where a lot of the data on growth and physical capital savings comes from, actually have estimates of total factor productivity growth, along with measures of investment in capital and PPP growth rates and all of that. And so if you have direct measurements of productivity growth, you don't really need to do these period fixed effects in a growth regression specification. You can just plug in productivity growth directly. And also, something I didn't mention the previous slide is that both Mankiw, and Weil, and the Islam paper, they both kind of assumed that productivity growth rate was basically, just to make it fit their specification, was the same both across countries and across time, which again was probably another somewhat heroic assumption that they made. Well, if you got direct measures of productivity growth that vary by country and vary by time, you don't need to make this assumption. Okay, so re-specify this. Basically, instead of using time period fixed effects, I'm plugging growth in productivity directly into my regression equation. So that's the G term in both of those specifications. And I get what I think are going to be somewhat nicer results. So here is the human capital savings with secondary school enrollment ratio, which was what we used in the previous papers. Column 2 is a repeat from what you saw in the previous table. Column 4 is a restricted sample. The downside of using total factor productivity estimates is that Penn World Tables don't have it for all countries and time periods, so I had to restrict the sample a little bit. But column 6 is basically the new results, using total factor productivity estimates directly in the regression equation. You get that the lambda parameter, the convergence rate is again pretty close to 2%. You get that the alpha parameter, the elasticity of physical capital savings, is once again pretty close to 1/3. And now the beta parameter, the elasticity with respect to human capital savings, is positive, significant, somewhat less than the 1/3 estimate that some people get through calibration exercises, but it's not that far away. If you do the same thing with educational attainment variables, here's the result that you get. Again, focus on column 6. You get a convergence rate close to 2%. You get physical capital, the elasticity is bumped up a bit to 44%. Beta's up to 59%. Again, a little uncomfortable with these results because you add alpha and beta together, you get a sum greater than 1. But at least you're getting a positive effect of human capital. Okay, so that was kind of step 1 of the paper. Step 2, which is kind of what I'm working on now, uses, because again, another issue is, are we using the right human capital variables? I'm not sure. So I'm trying to pick out the right, if you like, human capital variables using a lasso procedure. Now, this is kind of a sort of learning algorithm developed by Tip Shirani from 1996 called the least absolute shrinkage and selection operation, or LASSO, which I thought was a nice acronym. And basically what it does is it minimizes the sum of squares equation with the penalty for complexity, which is nice because it reduces the dimensionality of a regression with lots of potential covariates in it. If you don't have a whole lot of prior guidance as to which of the covariates are the most important. And I think human capital in a growth regression is probably a useful application for this. I mean, mathematically, what it does is it minimizes the following equation. You've got kind of a least squares objective function, although you could probably plug in a lot of different objective functions in here if you want. But then also what you've got is this times gamma plus, and then the sum of the absolute values of the estimated parameters in here. Now, kind of intuitively, the math here is that, well, it's not differentiable. This equation isn't quite differentiable, continuously differentiable near zero. So what do we have? Well, if you have beta parameters that are kind of close to zero, and the penalty can be changed with that gamma parameter, what you do is, so you've got a penalty parameter gamma, which penalizes the sum of the absolute value of the beta coefficients. And basically what that's going to do in an objective function is it's going to push kind of unimportant coefficients, basically coefficients that might otherwise be close to zero or don't do a very good job explaining variation in the regression. It's going to push those coefficients to zero. So it kind of gets rid of what you might think as sort of unimportant variables, if you like. Okay. So within the human capital data world, I use actually the Lee and Lee data set, which is kind of a sort of updated version of the most recent edition of the Barrow and Lee data set. It's got educational enrollment rates at the primary and secondary and tertiary levels by sex and combined. Educational attendance and completion rates for primary, secondary, and tertiary levels of education, both by sex and combined. And the number of years of schooling at primary, secondary, and tertiary enrollment, again, both by sex and combined. Okay, and basically you've got a data set with 14 different educational variables with sort of male, female, and combined observations within it. Okay. So first one is kind of looking at what we might call human capital savings variables, basically looking at school enrollment measures. So I plug in 9 different possible variables into a growth regression. Got primary school enrollment for males, females, both, secondary school enrollment for males, females, both, and tertiary school enrollment for males, females, both. Secondary school enrollment I've kind of bolded because that was actually the variable used in the Islam paper. Okay, and here's, I do the lasso, I pick out the variables that seem the most important, and here's what I end up getting. I end up getting a regression that has a convergence rate, again, close to 2%, that's nice. An alpha parameter that's, again, close to 1/3, that's kind of nice. And the 3 sort of most important human capital savings variables it picks out is secondary and school enrollment for females, tertiary school enrollment for males, and tertiary school enrollment for females. The only one that's kind of significant on its own is actually secondary school enrollment for females. But if you add these 3 coefficients together, kind of as a total effect of different measures of human capital savings, the sum becomes 0.226, which is highly significant. And again, you're kind of sort of getting in the neighborhood of 1/3. Okay, Take two, I did a human capital various accumulation variables, basically measures of educational attainment. You've got basically the fraction of the labor force that has no schooling, primary school completed, some secondary, whole bunch of variables on here. And the average number of years of total education for males, females, and both sexes. I highlighted average number of years of total education for both sexes. Again, that was what was used in the previous literature. Here's what the lasso selection algorithm picked out for me. Secondary completion rates for females, secondary completion rates for male, number of years of tertiary education for females, number of years of tertiary education for males. None of these are actually significant on their own, but jointly, you add them all up, you get, again, a coefficient that's pretty close to 1/3. Alpha is a little bit more than 1/3 in this case. And you've got a convergence rate that's about 2.7%, a little bit faster than 2%, but not that far away. So I think, this is obviously preliminary work. I'm still kind of working with it, but the solo literature, I think, it's got some econometric problems when there are too many fixed effects terms included in panel data regressions. And I don't think we really needed to do this because a lot of the more recent data sets that are out there can allow us to directly include TFP measures and regressions. Results with these measurements at time fixed effects seem to be, at least intuitively, a little bit better than some of the previous literature. And then I'm also kind of working with this lasso idea, trying to figure out which human capital variables are the most important. So I'm right at about 25 minutes, so I'll stop there. All right, thank you.
Yes, should I go on with the comment on the paper?
Okay, I'm just having really technical difficulties. We have a power outage here, so I'm using now my cell phone, and I'm using my cell phone as a hotspot. So, I mean, you have to bear that in mind. I might appear and disappear here and there. So this happens also in developed countries like Israel.
All right, good luck.
So I'm for the time being, I'm here. So I mean, okay. Carsten, if you can go ahead.
Yeah,
if you can go ahead.
I go ahead, and I show my presentation. And okay, first. And so you see the slides.
Good. Not yet.
Not yet. Okay.
I've got it.
Now
oh, yes. Whoops. Now they disappeared.
They disappeared. I'm sorry. Yeah. Again. Then okay. Okay. Now you see it. Yeah, that's nice. That's yeah. These are my comments on the paper, and this is a brief summary. I think I skip it because it was very well explained by William. The motivation of the paper. So what I can say overall, I think it's a very well structured or well organized paper. I think it's also well motivated. So it's clearly stated what this paper aims at, and I could follow it. I follow the paper quite easily, so it has a high readability. And I think I have only a few comments on the paper. To be honest, I'm not an econometrician. I'm an applied researcher and have also some experience with respect to growth economics, growth empirics, I'm sorry. And what I wanted to point it out here, that you just based your research on the famous Mankiw-Romer-Weil paper. And I think that's a good starting point, surely. But what is wrong with this paper somehow, I think, and what also comes out from your estimations, from the cross-country as well Panadata estimations, that you have this negative income share of a factor, of one of the production factors. And I might be, so the question, I think what maybe it's also another paper, but you can broaden a little bit the scope of your paper, because it's already related to the question, what model predicts the growth dynamics in a capitalist and a market economy in a better way, which describes it better, the neoclassical growth model or the endogenous growth model. And so we have a great question mark with regard to the neoclassical growth model, because human capital does not lead to endogenous growth, while it does so in an endogenous growth model. And so this might be also behind this peculiar results in the panel data estimations. Maybe that this is not only an econometric problem, but it's also a problem of the underlying economic theory. Maybe this is the question I would pose. And then I have a question, a second comment on the assumption. You outlined it also in your presentation regarding the variation of the human capital proxy school enrollment rates, for example, over time, so that the only variation that is more or less left over, if time fixed effects included, is a variation due to measurement errors, so to say. And it would be nice to see some statistical evidence in the paper for this, so that just that you underpin your hypotheses a little bit. Maybe it can be also some descriptive statistics, I don't know, or a simple analysis, ANOVA analysis, maybe, just to show that the variation just is reduced by the time fixed effects, and how this variation of the human capital variable might split. And then if I look at table 5, where you show the coefficients for the time fixed effects, I have the impression they vary to a high degree between the different periods. And so I suspect there's still some business cycle effects in these coefficients shown up. Turn up, I guess. And so maybe you might use a simple solution would be just to use 10-year averages, but I don't know how much this reduces your data points. I don't know. But this may be maybe a supplement for your testing strategy. And my last point is regarding the lasso analysis. I think I haven't looked into this part of your paper, to be honest, because I'm not, first of all, it is preliminary, as you said already, and then I had also some time constraints, to be honest, and I'm sorry about this. But I have, because what is interesting, what I understood, because I'm not familiar with lasso. I have just looked up the internet for this, and I have learned that you somehow shrink or constrain the set of possible of the estimated coefficients. And what would be, from this point of view, what would be a nice complement to this robust analysis would be an outlier robust regression, because an outlier robust regression, the main feature is not to constrain the coefficient, but to downweight outlying observations of the data. So this is just another strategy to come to terms with the complexity of the models and to deal with outlying observations. And so I have myself, I have done this also in a growth empirics paper in 2009, but it's much better explained by Zaman and others in a 2001 economics letters paper. So I think that might be well worth at least to consider. So these are my comments to the paper. Thank you very much for this really well-written paper.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, and the sort of is the neoclassical model versus the more endogenous growth theory model. That is an outstanding question, and yeah, I have a tendency to start with the solo model just because I think it has very nice structural properties. But if the econometrics don't match up with it, then that doesn't matter that much. But yeah, so no, I think that would be a good idea, and I'll look at. I also like the 10-year sensitivity analysis. That's probably a good idea, and I'll look at those outlier robust regression papers. Thank you for that. Appreciate it.
Is there questions from the audience?
Yes, Roland raised the hand.
Go ahead.
The question would be, it's all data for the whole economy. Did you run sectoral, or do you think you can run sectoral analysis? Or even, which I did in my old thesis 35 years ago, I went to financial statements of four big firms, four big firms, and of the chemical industry as a whole. R&D was my factor, but this is the output of human capital. So any question to do this on a lower level of aggregation?
That would be an interesting thing. So I'm trying to think. So the specification would be looking at the various human, I mean, obviously the physical capital savings and so forth would be straightforward, but looking at something like average levels of education and training or something like that within different sectors. I hadn't thought about that, but that would be a possibility. That might be an interesting study to look at if it works at kind of a more micro level. Yeah. No, I mean, this was obviously a very sort of cross-country paper, but it might be something that could be interesting to look at. Yeah, at a more industry-wide level. Hadn't thought about that.
Other questions? Okay, if we don't have other questions, then we are moving on to the third presentation by Roland Bardy. So go ahead, Roland.
It will be Arthur Rubens who starts. And I just say to him, why don't we tell the audience these were two papers on economic research, and ours will be hopefully a welcome intermission. It's a policy paper.
Yeah.
Arthur.
Roland, did you want me to share my screen, or did you have a PowerPoint?
Yes, you share your screen.
All right, let me get that up. One second there. Let me get out of there. Are we seeing that okay?
Nope.
No? Okay. Give me a second, please. How's that? Do we have it shared?
We have
You
it.
guys see it?
Yep.
Okay. Okay. Super. Super. Yeah, as Roland said, ours is less on the quantitative side, much more policy and in nature. And of course, I do want to say, William, when really enjoyed your paper, and I wonder if you could include internet usage as well, more social capital into your presentation. But anyway, our presentation is the internet, a public good in the COVID pandemic. And do we need more governance? Roland, do you want to do a brief introduction of yourself, and then I'll do myself?
Well, it's on the slide. I worked in a big company, and after 30 years, I resigned, and that's 20 years ago, and I started teaching And presently, my last appointment was in Florida Gulf Coast. My first was at Gozueta and various other. No tenure anywhere, just adjunct and executive professor, however you call it.
Yeah, and you know, I want to say, you know, I came to the acquaintance of Rowan when I was professor of management at Florida Gulf Coast University, which, by the way, was a brand new university. And he was one of the first executives to approach us and be part of our executive professorship. It was
that's because I have a home in Florida.
Absolutely, absolutely. But
a second home.
By the way, we live in Naples, Florida, which has the largest contingent of retired Fortune 500 executives, some would say in the nation. So many of them came forward, but few of them performed. And Rowan definitely did. I retired in August 2017. And since then, I've continued my research, and I'm a visiting professor at Audencia Business School in Nantes, France, mostly teaching online now, unable to go to France. But when we look at our paper, we're talking about, you know, the internet. And as we said, you know, it's more of a policy piece. And when we think of the internet by nature is a public good that has benefits and, yes, you know, challenges as well. And we also say it does have links and strong links to sustainable development. Now, during the COVID pandemic, we saw both positive and negative effects of the pandemic. Of the internet, but one thing that we saw very clearly and very succinctly is that the pandemic changed how people looked at the internet. That really highlighted how important the internet is, and really, it's every individual, every household, every community. There was that, you know, dramatic need for the internet for connectivity. It also influenced policymakers, different government spokesperson, and those, you know, looking forward in the government to the fact that the internet is very much a public good, and that people across the country and across the world need access to it. It also highlighted a number of different issues surrounding the use of the internet. And what we would say and what we bring forward is this need to manage it. And how do you manage it, and how do you regulate it? So very briefly, our paper will examines the different structures and the different arguments for the internet in the context of it being a public good. Now, when we talk about public good, and I just very want to briefly, you know, present this, that public goods are goods that, well, largely benefit society and that serve some type of collective public purpose. Samuelson and Buchanan, they speak of these pure public goods, and these goods that are non-rivalous in nature and non-excludable in nature, non-rivalous in the sense that individual consumption of a good does not affect another person's opportunity to consume the good, and non-excludable, it doesn't exclude people. Everybody has access to the goods. When we think of public goods, we can, you know, think of national defense, for example, or the police department, or parks and beaches. But, you know, for example, with national defense, taxes are paid, everybody is protected or assumed to be protected. Now, in the US, for example, a lot of national defense is contracted out to contracted services, but it's all for the same purpose, the good of people. When we think of COVID, on a more, current level, the vaccinations are all part of the process of providing public goods. Now, in contrast, we, of course, have private goods. Private goods are both rivalrous. They compete, for different products, and they exclude people. If you are not able to pay for it, then, well, you can be excluded, from it. There's also aspects of, what some would call quasi or semi-rivalrous or semi-excludable goods. For example, we have highways, roads, these are public goods, but, they can exclude certain individuals when, well, you go down the toll road. You have to pay some type of fee or with that. Schools, considered, primary and secondary anyway, public goods. At, certain schools, well, they're private, or if you want special tutoring, or universities, especially in the US, they're quite costly indeed. Beaches are considerably or considered to be public and open to the public, but we have a situation in Florida, most recently passed by the former governor, where, the beaches are only at the shoreline are considered public, and anything that goes from the house to the shoreline is considered private. So we have this kind of splitting of the hairs with, when we looked at, what are the goods, what are the private goods, what are the public goods with it. But anyway, let me move the discussion over to Rowan, and he's going to talk briefly about the aspect of the internet innovation and as a public good. Rowan?
Right. You have heard the public goods argument. The counter argument might be this is just another innovation. When we talk about innovations come about not just by private inventors, like we have here two examples. The microchip and touchscreen technology was a public-private partnership which brought this about. Technically, what the internet is an invention by MIT scientists. So the question is, what is this publicness about? Well, the publicness is that we have an access to this which is free, or more or less free for everyone. So if it's an invention or an innovation, it cannot be free, because otherwise inventors would not do any invention anymore. Next slide, please. So that would mean that we have to go back to when the idea of free information flow was started. That was more or less 300 years ago by Nicolas de Caritat, Marquis of Condorcet. He said, there will be a time when, and now there is a time. And so today we have to ask, who owns information? What about if someone copies information? Is this free? Are there limits to privacy? Should access be regulated, and how? And can one country do a regulation and another cannot? And do we have like a virtual class, the famous technology gap, people who are in the position to use the internet and the others not? So the free access to information is the crucial point. And hence, next slide, please, the question, where does that lead with regard to regulation? Must end in the answer, it has to be a communal task. But if it's a communal task, who has to partake in this effort? How should it be designed? Will be the public sector, the private sector? Will it be civil society organizations? What are the different responsibilities? Is a long list of questions: who, why, where, when. But definitely, next slide, it has to be a task in which the business sector is involved. We have here Milton Friedman, who said business is about profits, and we have Peter Drucker, who said business is a part of the society. So there is a business case. Next slide, please. The business case also says it's for the businesses, but it's also a business case for the civil society organizations. So with this, we have a big mass of questions and a big group of people who are affected and should be involved. And from there, I go back to Arthur, because what we are talking about are pros and cons, Arthur.
Yeah, and with anything, and thank you, Rowan, with anything, you always have positive and negatives. Nothing is clearly straightforward, or maybe a few things are, but and we embrace them. But when we look at it generally, when we look at the internet, and of course, it's relatively new. Technology has come forward, although many of you and some of you I'm talking to right now were brought up with it. We came prior to internet, people like Rowan and I. But it's great for information. Links businesses together, and we just put an array of different things here. Ability to share knowledge, across different platforms. The idea that we're communicating across different countries right now. Well, we communicate, we can form partnerships and alliances with education, and me being coming from academia. Some of you coming from academia, know it well, or maybe, within your institution, even prior to COVID, people said, well, let's do online learning because, well, we can educate everybody. Your class size can go from 30 or 40 to hundreds or thousands, as if, that would be a viable alternatives. It's from social perspective, it's, a whole generation of people are communicating, different virtual ways or different communicative ways that, heretofore was never done. Now, with that said, you also have, of course, negative involvements with it. Of course, and you see it frequently, where different information can be hidden from more protective devices on the internet to protect information from young people, legal information, inappropriate information. Recently in the US, across a whole swath of the US, there was a hacking incident with Colombier oil company, and oil prices skyrocketed. But there's a vulnerability to hackers, with it. And very importantly, and what we see, as each keystroke is that we put into it, and then we go to maybe one of our social medium, and all of a sudden we see it, that keystroke being displayed in Facebook or Instagram or some other medium, that the privacy of the individual, information is power, and we can see it. And of course it can be used for, bad means, to incite groups to violent how But let's, and here when we're talking about the internet, let's jump over to COVID. How did it impact, those, positive and negatives when we look at the COVID pandemic? And I want to say, very clearly, my opinion is that, those countries that did well, especially initially, they used the internet, in a very positive way, disseminating public health information, early testing, tracing, monitoring people that were quarantined or isolated people. And, this system created the availability to that. When COVID in January, when it was first brought forward to, the world's attention, I mean, you saw scientists, across countries coming together already starting to work on vaccines and sharing information. So, these powerful synergies of partnerships and alliances were created. The work environment, all of a sudden people were unable to go to the workplace. And of course, the internet provided the availability for people to keep working. And, the results are that, some companies are going to continue to do it. This pandemic will change how work has been done previously. I have a colleague and she works for a very large insurance company. She told me recently at the onset when everybody was asked to go online, there was a survey done of the workers. And the survey was how many people would like to continue to work online. And in the neighborhood of 80% said they would. They were housed at one time in, I think, a 17 or 18-story building, and they had the whole building. Well, now they only have 3 floors. That's all they need. The other floors have become available. So we see this movement towards that. And of course, the same thing with education. Education, as I said before, toyed with the idea of online learning. Online learning is important, but what degree of, we'll say, concentration did it have in the educational institutions? Well, now it's very significant, and it took the crisis of COVID to push them forward, to do that. And of course, very, very important, and much research has been done on it, and more research will be done on what has been the social effects of COVID on people, their ability to interact, and how has the internet played into it. Okay, let's flip over to the negative. They're very similar to what you find in the general sense of it, that occurred during COVID. Of course, we saw inappropriate equipment, test kits being sold, but the issues of security, people hacking, of the sense of privacy, especially with health information, were all, was negative involvements, that occurred as a result of it. In particular, and we've heard much literature on it, the idea of conspiracy theories. I don't know how it played out in some other countries, but my God, it truly played out, dramatically in the US. I mean, this whole idea that wearing masks and getting vaccination is politicized. Well, 20, 30 years ago, one would never have thought that to be the case. And again, finally, a vulnerability to hackers. So let's moving on to when we talk of governance and when we talk about, the internet, we want to look at the challenges and where do we go from here? Where do we look at the future, and what are those challenges that people are facing? And I think one of the biggest ones, both on a local perspective as well as on a global perspective, is access to the medium. When schools were forced into online learning, you had certain communities, they had the equipment, they had the hardware, they very quickly adapted to it. Of course, you had other communities that they didn't have the software, they didn't have the hardware, they didn't have the ability to connect. And of course, we have the same thing in developing countries. So when we look at, say, sustainable development goals, looking to it, for the future, education, which access to education, William was talking about attendance with education in his presentation. It's a huge factor. And of course, with inability to access and have this equipment, it had a huge impact on education. Security, both at the global or the local level, spread of false information. Amer just talked about, yes, he's in a developed country, but internet outages occurs. And well, they occur with us in all countries. And I don't know how it is in certain countries, but, in particular in the US, the speed of the internet, the cost of the service. I sometimes say that the idea that our market-based system does not provide for what some would say a public good, because there is a cost, there is, other factors, companies competing against each other. So one doesn't have the access to it. But looking at globally, there's a number of issues out there: copyright protection, safeguard to protect information. Very big one that has come up before, that is coming up again, is net neutrality. Who will? What institutions or what entities have access to it? Should all people have the same access, or do some groups more equal than other groups? Enforcement of policies, and of course, different issues of human rights and sovereignties, and going into other countries, how do you address issues of government oversight, or we'll say just the blockage of the internet to not allow the free flowing of information? And anyway, this is just a sampling of some of the things that we saw, but let me flip it back over to Roland so he can talked about this issue of privacy.
This is just a sample, but it's not a sample, it's a myriad of challenges. I picked up one challenge because I live in Europe and I live in America, if I am allowed into sometime in the summer. And I can feel this the transatlantic divide with regard to privacy regulation. And in COVID times, we had a big problem in Germany, because Germany was the state or the nation in Europe which most restrictively interpreted the European Union-based rule for privacy protection. It's not the same rule everywhere. Each state in Europe is allowed or is entitled to do its own specification. And we were very specific. So take the issue of vaccine centers. All this has to be managed by one software for 80 million people, because if it would be handled locally, one authority would have to shift data to the other and up, and this is not allowed. So we have a big problem with privacy protection, especially in the time of COVID. We were noting this, and that's why I stick to this issue on this slide. But we know there are others. So the others, if you go to the next one,
sure.
The others are, next one, yes, please. The others are, no, one back. That was too quick. The others are well respected by the Working Group on Internet Governance. This definition is from 2005, which shows that this has been in the making for some time. And we all know it's about resources, it's about usage, it's about content, it's about people enabling people to work with the internet. But how can this be done? And in the COVID pandemic, the awareness has risen. So how can this be done? The next slide, please. There are approaches which are focused on the actors, and there are the 5 levels in this slide. It's the user, it's the providers group, it's social forces like social groups and user groups, it's organizations who work in this field, like the working group, which I just mentioned, and it's the governments. And they can use sanctions, or they can use norms, or they can use mechanisms. There are 2 acronyms here in the slide, which is image recognition. Image recognition is a very fine tool. And we all know what other tools have been used to throw Mr. Trump out of internet, of Twitter and the Facebook. So there are mechanisms. And the mechanisms is one part. Next slide, please. I will rush up a little because we are running out of time. So the mechanisms regard transactions, and the other part is content. And we know, and that was what Arthur said before, the challenges or the threats of fake news and the internet being misused. And there are transactional mechanisms that can be used, but it's also about watching over the content of the net. And that's a very difficult task. Arthur, please, the next slide, which, next one, yes, which has to once again go back to the 5 levels: users, organizations, governments. Now you have to click various times because I have animated this slide. Sure. What does come up is we found in the internet there are negative involvements. Next, we have now a lot of technology improvements for monitoring and prevention of fraudulent sales and fake information. Next, please. We have cybersecurity. Well, the Americans have now suffered of cyber crime regarding a simple system in the oil, in the gas distribution. So cybersecurity is one big issue, and there are 2 more slides, more clicks are there. How do you censor false information? Who will be the censor? And how can you make sure that violent action regarding government restrictions? Well, we have seen this in Germany and in other countries where people march in the streets and they say COVID is just a fake news. So this is, again, a huge topic, and which brings us to the conclusion, Arthur, that, like William said, this is a work in progress, but not ours. William will finish his work. This has to be finished by, I don't know, right now this is not where all the actors contribute to this effort, but it's in the making, and this is what we just want to make aware of with this paper.
Yeah, and and just in closing, like the internet, which historically it was not thought of as a public good, but truly, and I believe that COVID has highlighted it more than anything else, that it's essential for people's life. Now that, and we have to say, if it is truly recognized as a public good, then comes the question, how do you provide it to all people and every household, every entity out there, to give them that fairness, that equalness, in order to be, we'll say, part of society. But in doing that, there are the different risks involved, and of course, privacy and some of the other things that we brought forward, and false information. How do you manage it? For many, many years, people have said the internet is new and it's kind of like a open range, and people really don't know how to manage it. Now, post-COVID, we really need to, we as national bodies and as global bodies need to address how are we going to use this service and how will it be managed and protected, in the future. But anyway, I want to thank you very much. And I know Rowan thanks you as well. And we leave it open for the comments and the feedback from you guys.
Okay, so William, can you go ahead and present your discussion?
Sure, certainly. So thank you, and I think this paper, the presentation, did a very good job, I think, at outlining a lot of the main issues that have always probably been latent in discussing the internet, but I think have, as you correctly point out, have become very much more highlighted by the COVID-19 pandemic. I mean, obviously, right now we're having a conference on Zoom because we can't get together in person, and this puts the benefits of the internet into highlights it certainly, but Then also, as somebody who's been teaching online during the past year, and seeing some of the digital divide issues and so forth that you bring up in the paper, there's obviously a lot of work there, and some downsides as well in terms of spread of misinformation, conspiracy theories, and all the stuff that you bring up. So I think the paper does a very good job at highlighting a lot of the big issues that have both been outstanding for a while, but have also been thrown into sharper contrast because of the ongoing pandemic. As you mentioned, this is primarily a policy paper. I'm coming at it, I guess, from an academic perspective. But I think, in terms of the thing that maybe struck me a little bit, you discussed this a bit in the presentation. You start off with describing the internet as a public good. And I guess, as an academic economist, I do kind of go straight to the, public good, non-excludable, non-rivalrous. Well, the internet, I mean, I think it's pretty excludable. Certainly if we're worried about a digital divide, it's because, some people don't have the money to get an internet service provider. And then, even once you're on the internet, there are issues with, individual sites can have paywalls, or government actors or non-government actors sometimes can just can decide to block content. The whole issue with, say, net neutrality in the U.S. Has, is arguably an argument about whether or not internet content ought to be excludable by private firms and so forth. So I think, the internet, I don't necessarily see it as an excludable good. I think non-rivalrous is a little bit more justifiable. I think a lot of the content on the internet can be provided with approximately zero marginal cost. I mean, some of the higher bandwidth stuff, maybe not, but I think, the point being that the public good framing, I understand, this is obviously, we're talking about, is this something that benefits the general public? Yes, certainly. But I guess as an academic economist, the public good framing, kind of wonder, does it meet some of the technical definitions of a public good? Arguably not. Now, that doesn't really invalidate a lot of the rest of what you said. I think, I think maybe a better way to frame it might be in terms of externalities, in terms of both in terms of the good benefits that the internet provides, in terms of information dissemination, and really even, most dramatically here in terms of public health, both allowing people to stay home and giving them proper information. There are, important positive externalities, positive benefits to the internet. And then there are also, arguably negative ones in terms of, sort of the incitement and conspiracy theories and so forth. And I think that that does produce a good argument for some of the regulatory issues that you brought up. And without maybe necessarily getting to whether or not the internet is technically a public good or not. So maybe just in terms of framing that way might be a way to think about it. Also, I think, just with, you touched on it briefly, but just thinking about in regulatory schemes, I was also thinking a little bit, maybe some of the kind of more public choice aspects of this, that, obviously the internet is kind of by intention a very international creation, but regulation is largely national, and in some cases subnational. Thinking a little bit more in terms about how some of the regulatory coordination across jurisdictions would work out might be an issue too that you might want to explore a little bit. But yeah, I mean, I think in terms of laying out a lot of the big issues in terms of both the benefits and possible harms caused by the internet, and especially in a COVID-19 world, And I think the paper hits a lot of those points very well. So I enjoyed reading it. Thank you.
Thank you, William.
Thank you, William. I think externalities and public choice, these are two topics which would have to go into this effort which we are talking about. I think Abur, if I may hasten this up, because the Germans have a bad wording, den letzten beißen die Hunde, which means the last one will be bitten by the dogs, or bitten by, so that's you. I could jump over if you want to what I want to place.
By the way, Roland, by the way, I'm married to German, so you better be careful.
Yeah, you know what it means. Better than this.
Okay, and can I just make one comment too, and just in response to William, when we frame it in the public good concept, it comes and you said it as well, that it comes post-COVID. And when we look at other items, education, well, is primary and secondary education a public good? Well, yes, we'll say it's a public good. Well, if it's a public good, you have to have the ability to have access to it. And the ability to have access to it involves virtual online environment. So it's evolving. So I think in the sense when we talk about the evolvement, the evolution of it, this pandemic has accelerated things to put us in a position where all of a sudden, like, oh my gosh, I guess it is a public good. Now, what do we do? And how do we move forward with it? Nations of the world and so forth. But anyway, again, thank you very, very much. And we'd love to see it in your research as well, the measurement.
Thank you, Arthur. Okay. Now we are moving to my paper, and then Roland will start.
Yeah, if I may.
Thanks, Roland, for preparing this.
I'm sorry. I want to add also a remark on the paper.
Okay. Go ahead,
a short one, because I worked also together with a colleague at university on public goods a lot, and in particular on public intermediate goods. And from my point of view, it's clearly a public good in contrast to the view by William, although I'm also a public economist, because I think the constitutional characteristic of a public good is not the non-excludability, but it's a non-rivalry. And this is certainly true for a public good. And even I would dare say that at the moment, because if you have a smartphone, how old it is, you can have simply access, and mainly the cost of provision for the contract with the provider are so low, so you have effectively marginal cost of zero in the end. And if what would be interesting to view it from the concept of a merit good by Richard Musgrave. Maybe you know this old-fashioned concept, which is really out of fashion today, but it may be useful to view the internet in this way. Might be, because then the government could say that everybody should have a basic package, like, for example, for health insurance. Could be that we define it in this way. Should have a basic, because everybody should have access to the internet, because then this public good is more of a public input, because it enables us to produce public goods like online education, for example. Because you can see it also in this way. It's a productive input more than it's both a consumption good, I think, as well as an intermediary input as well. And then I want to give you maybe a reference from a colleague of mine who worked on public goods a long time, who died much too early, sadly. It is written by Michael Pickard, and I give you the references on the chat just right after my comment. So it's called 50 Years After Samuelson's The Pure Theory of Public Expenditure. And what are we left with? And it might be of great interest to you how to evaluate the internet in this respect. If it's a public good, a mixture, and usually public and private goods are tied to each other. For example, cinema. a cinema is a public good in a way, but it's tied to, you have to buy the seat to get into the cinema, and then you have a provision of a public good. That's a movie, essentially. That's a public good. But
Thank
it's
you.
a constraint. I'm sorry. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Okay, but please send that contact that via chat.
And we will send you about our book. we had a presentation yesterday.
You will go ahead and okay, Roland, if you can share with us.
Arthur, you have to discontinue sharing. Someone is sharing the slide.
I'm sharing. Okay, let me see how I do that.
No, I guess it was William, isn't it?
Yeah, I thought it was William, but he said it's not.
I have.
Oh yeah, stop share. Stop share.
Okay,
sorry,
okay.
Sorry.
So I'm coming up with this one here. I will be very quick because I'm seeing we have a round of experts here, but I was seeing that autoregressive distributed lag configuration is not in everyone's knowledge. Well, one might start from what I'm doing here at the very beginning. Or what is autoregression? What is distributed lags? And that ordinary least square regression only works if a variable is stationary. If it is not, and we have seen this in Christian Colombier, he had some smoothing for his polynomial regression. He used first differences, and that is what autoregressive distributed lag is about as well. It just configures the equation, and so instead of the normal regular regression, it uses deltas, not necessarily, but it starts with deltas on the right-hand side. It could use deltas on the left-hand side or not, but the deltas are summed up from one time period to time period p for the dependent variable, self-explaining, autoregressive, and then it does the same thing for the explanatory variable. And then it is, the idea would be that from a situation like here, we get to a situation like here through this confirmation or configuration. Some people say confirmation. If it's true, must be proved by a test. And there are various types of testing for this. And interestingly, I looked up Amer and found his 2003 article where he applied the Dickey-Fuller text or augmented Dickey-Fuller text. And in his new presentation, which will just be going here to here, he shows something else, which shows how this all evolves 2003 to 2021, in my case, 1974 thesis. I'm old-fashioned in all this. I have always to catch up, and I never catch up. So that is.
Can you share the screen with us? We don't see it.
You don't see it?
No.
Sorry. I was thinking. So wait a minute. Where are you all? It doesn't come.
You have to have it open. You have to have the presentation open and then share.
I have to have it open first.
Yeah.
Sorry. But then I have to move this away somewhere. I'm using PDF. Arthur, can you jump in and show the PowerPoint slides? Obviously, my PDF is hammering this.
So you can close it, I guess. Yeah, now, yeah, good.
Yeah. This is Arthur?
Yeah, now we'll see it.
Yeah. So that was I was talking about right now. What is autoregression? What is distributed lag? How do we configure a time series which has a non-stationary movement? Well, this is all known by, I think, most of you. And I'm just saying there are various methodologies. Polynomial regression smoothing, which was Carsten Colombier, was one method. And the other method, next slide, please. I'm moving. Are you?
You have to, yeah.
Yeah, Arthur. So what the autoregressive distributed lag configuration is about is it's taking out autoregression by introducing lags into the equation. And then measuring this equation, which is the second one I just said, before doing this, one must be sure that it's now a type of stationery, and there are various tests. And I was just saying, Amer, when I found out about his 2003 article, which is very nice to read, he applies another test in his new presentation. He applies a new test. So, which brings me to the last slide. I had this nice opportunity to see Amer's government expenditures, military spending, and economic growth, which he just mentioned when Carsten was presenting. And he found out that it depends on which type of government expenditure you look at. And certainly in times of threat, which he will present now, this is up and down and by no means stationary. I found a very nice German language presentation about Iran. So it says when you look at the foreign investment in Iran, it always goes up and down, and then it dwindles and is not there anymore. This is also a non-stationary effect from the sanctions. And yes, the day before yesterday, and I invited her to come, and she's not here, unfortunately. There are so many interesting sessions. Juliana Mattei gave is no one there anymore? No, there was Candida just left. Juliana studied whether the pandemic risk of COVID-19, and there are several interesting indicators, like the stringency index, the containment index, the health economic or the economic support, the government response index. So there are a few indexes who picture this situation, and then she wants to find out what happens to the financial security or stability in those 14 EMU economies. So this is cross-sector, but anyhow, it's also an RLDL model she was applying. I was hoping she would be here. She could contribute more than I. Sorry for being repetitive, but I'm now leaving, or no other has to give away. So Albert comes in. Thank you.
Thank you, Roland. So 1 second, I'm going to just share my screen, and then okay. Do you see my screen? Everybody? Yeah. Okay, good. So the last presentation is mine, and I'm going to talk about the demand, the Israeli demand for military expenditure. Somehow now it became like more like nowadays.
Very timely.
Yeah, trendy. So in fact, I really worked a lot on the Israeli-Arab conflict. I have a lot of work on that. I'm doing basically like okay, the economic aspects of the conflict. I asked many questions, but for the talk of today, I'm going to talk about, okay, what determines Israel's military spending. So we divide. This is a joint work with my colleague Christos Kolias from Greece. So we look at three major determinants of military spending of Israel. This is very typical for most of the countries. The first thing is the threats, okay, the economic capabilities, and some political factors that are kicking in, okay? So basically what I'm going to do is just look at these variables and see how they affect Israel's demand for military spending. This is about the talk. So, I mean, most probably all of you are aware of recent, I mean, in the last days, most probably, even if you were not aware of the conflict, then it became like in the scope of international scope. Israel was established in 1948 in the aftermath of World War II, and then as a home state for Jews. By the way, I'm not Jew, I'm Arab, so I'm in between the two, an Israeli Arab. So I'm just, really in between the two sides. So I can understand both sides basically. Okay. What you know, the whole thing is that Israel, of course, is like surrounded by Arab countries. Let's call them enemies. Okay, and Israel has to maintain its power, maintain its supremacy, like military supremacy, by allocating resources, really heavy resources into the army. Okay, and it's not a secret that Israel's army is one of the most sophisticated armies in the world. Okay. But of course, once you allocate a lot of your resources into the army, then of course it is at the account of other civilian uses. Okay, so here I have some chronology of events. Okay, of course, Israel had many wars, starting from 1948, going to 56. 67, when Israel occupied lands from Jordan, from Egypt, and from Syria, okay, and going into the War of 73, War of 81 with Lebanon, and so many wars, and not only wars, there are some operations, and the last was like last week, ended yesterday, another operation in Gaza. Okay, to try to stop like missiles arriving from Gaza. Okay, all these, of course, wars and operations are at a very heavy cost. Not only economic cost, but also in lives and in like ruining the whole routine, the whole daily life. Okay, so if we have a look at the evolution of the military spending of Israel over time, I have here two graphs. One of the military burden, which is like the military spending divided by the GDP, the share of military from the GDP. Then, of course, we can see that it is going up until the 1973 basically war. Okay. And then in 77, Sadat, the president of Egypt at the time, started visited Israel, and the peace process started first with Egypt, and then with Jordan, and then some peace talks with Palestinians. And of course, you see that the military burden is going really sharply decreasing, okay? From about 0.3, almost 30% of GDP going to the military, up to about 5% of the GDP. Okay. Okay. I am also talking about the absolute military spending, and here you have the log of military spending. Okay. You just see that. Okay. All the time, of course, in absolute terms, you are increasing spending. Okay, increasing spending. But as a share, it's going down almost all. Since the late 70s, it's going down steadily. Okay. Okay. So as I said, okay, what determines really the military demand of Israel? Then we have three groups, okay, of variables. Threats. Okay. When I say threats, I mean usually in defense economics, you relate to the what your enemies spend on their military arsenal. Okay. We talk about, okay, if we talk about military burden, so we look at the military burden of your enemies, okay? So when I say enemies, we usually, I mean, when we talk about the conflict, we refer to the immediate neighbors of Israel, Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, okay? And recently we can add Iran for sure. Like for the last 20 years, there's like the attempt of Iran to develop nuclear bombs, and Israel feels like very threatened by that. Okay, since Iran sees Israel as an enemy, so Israel looks alike at the Iranian. Also, we can talk about Turkey as being one of the powers that threat Israel, because Turkey is taking a pro-Palestinian approach. Okay, so we also look at the Turkish military spending as part of the threat that is Israel is facing. Okay. Okay. Then next, the capabilities. We proxy the capabilities by the GDP. We can talk about GDP per capita. We can talk about the growth of the GDP. Okay, all those are proxies of how much resources we have to spend. Okay, okay. What's the whole pie, and then from that pie, how much we can allocate to spend to military spending. Okay. Then I move on to some political variables. I take several. First of all, wars and military operations. We saw a lot of those. So basically, we take a dummy variable taking the value 1 in years of wars and major military operations. In addition, we look at some political variables. We talk about election years. And now we are about to enter, or maybe to have our 5th election in Israel in 2 years. Okay, we had already 4 in the last year and a half, and the 5th is about here. Okay, we don't have government yet, so we might have a 5th election. So we are taking also elections as maybe affecting the decision how much to spend on military. Okay. Another thing that we take, we look at whether the right parties, namely the Likud party, maybe they spend more since they are more nationalistic. Okay, they might tend to spend more on military. Okay. Rather than civilian causes. Okay. Other variables that we are taking the population size the population size is taken to is kind of like a public good element here. Okay. So we are taking population size, and we're taking some dummy variables that are derived from some indigenous structure breaks that we are making. Okay. We can, of course, take some given years that we think that they are we have like structural breaks in them, but rather we just let the data talk. So there are some indigenous structure break tests, okay, and we let the data talk and basically determine which years we had some breaks in the regressions, okay. Okay, so we don't decide, it is the data decides basically, okay? Okay, so Roland already talked about ARDL. So we are applying ARDL. So as you can see, ARDL is expressed as the level of our variable of interest, Y. In this case, it is the military spending, okay? Military spending in absolute terms, or as a share of GDP, and you can see, of course, it's a function of flags of the dependent variable as well as of the independent variables. Okay, okay. The x's here are the independent variables. Okay, good. So this is the RDL and levels terms, but we can also express it in what it's called ECM representation, in which we express the delta of YT. This allows us this correction model, error correction model, allows us to look at both the long term, long run, and the short run. But we are focused only on the long run, okay? So we talk basically about whether we have co-integration, long run relationship, which is given by the levels here, okay? By the levels of the independent and dependent variables, okay? So basically we are interested in the B's Okay, the coefficients that are of interest to us are the B's here. Okay, good. In addition to ARDL, we also make use of other co-integration methods. And we have, as I mentioned before, fully modified OLS, canonical co-integration regression, dynamic OLS. Okay, those methods give us, of course, the co-integration equations. But before we can use those, we have to test whether we have co-integration or not. Okay, so we are making some use of the Hansen and the Parks co-integration tests. Okay, there are many co-integration tests, but those are we used along with these methods. Okay, so what we have data from CIPRI. I'm not sure if you there's like an institute in Stockholm that basically collects data about military. So we have from the 60s, and we complemented from data that I collected from other resources. Okay, basically from the early 60s. Okay, and we have, as I said, we have some variables that we are using. So as a measure of threat, we use the sum of Arab military spending or the weighted military burden. Okay, this is the variable that measures the threat that Israel is facing. Okay. Okay, so what we found when we used ARDLs, once again, we are talking about the long run relationship. Okay, this is what we are focusing on. Okay, so before we use ARDL, you have to, one of the prerequisites of using ARDL, you have to make sure that your variables are at most of I1. They have unit root only, and we cannot have I2. So either I0, stationary, or unit root, I1. This is the condition for using ARDL. Okay, so what we found when we, okay, here is the test if you are interested. This is the Dickey-Fuller test of unit root. We found that, okay, that all our variables are fulfilling the requirement. Okay, so that all the variables, as you can see here, all the variables are of at most I1, at most I1. Okay, so, okay, so our findings. Okay, first of all, we found that the speed of adjustment is significantly negative. This is necessary condition for co-integration. Okay, co-integration. We have co-integration. So when we use ARDL, we have some tests that are called the Pisaranchin and Smith bounds test for co-integration. Okay, I'm not sure if you are familiar with this, but you know there are two tests that are given here that basically confirm if we have co-integration or not. If you don't have confirmation, you cannot use the coefficients here. Okay, the long run coefficients. So our tests confirm that we have co-integration. Both tests here confirm that we have co-integration. Okay, so what we find, I mean the results that we find, back to, sorry. 1 second, I have to go back to the, okay. So, I mean, one of the problems that can be there in ARDL that we have serial correlation. So we have like tests of serial correlation, and we have also a test of heteroskedasticity. Okay, we don't have any serial correlation, and our errors are homoskedastic. So we don't have problem of heteroskedasticity. Okay, what are the results of the ARDL, the long run relationships that we find? First of all, we find that military spending is significantly positively related to the size of the economy. Basically, the higher the GDP, the higher the military spending. Okay, so it is obvious that if you have more resources, you can spend more on military. Okay, so we confirm this, we find this. Okay, and what we also found that if you have a larger population, then there's a tendency to reduce your spending, military spending. Okay, this could be that, okay, once you have really larger population, you tend maybe more to channel your resources to civilian uses rather than military uses. Okay. Also, you can look at it as we have like increasing returns to scale, most probably, right? I mean, you don't have to if your population goes up, you don't have really to invest a lot more on military than with a smaller population. Okay. The other thing that we found was that Israel reacts positively to that threat. Okay, once your enemies spend more, okay, you spend also more. This is typical of what we call a military race, okay, or arms race. Okay, and they have several papers showing, and under many specifications, that both sides react to each other. Basically, you can think of it as a reaction function of one side to other sides. Okay, so Israel, we found here, since we are focused here on Israel, that Israel reacts to Arabs' rising spending. Okay, but we didn't find such reaction to Iranian or Turkish. Okay, we might look at it again. We might limit the discussion to maybe the last 30 years, because the Iranian threat is recent one. Okay, so since we took the whole period, it might be that this, of course, changes the results, since at the beginning, of course, the effect is zero. Okay, the effect of Iranian spending on Israeli military is zero. So it might be that this reduce the effect that we see. Okay, so this is what we are going to do, might limit our attention to just the last 30 years to see if the Iranian threat is really significant or not. Okay. Okay. Another thing that we found that the military spending, okay, of Israel rises in the years of wars or military operations, which makes sense again. Okay, that when you have a war, of course, you have to increase your spending, military spending. We don't find that right parties affect the military spending, which is quite surprising to me. Okay, surprising to me. Okay, also we didn't find that in election years there's more spending, military spending. Okay, we didn't find that. Okay, so of course this was using logs of military burden and military spending. We did the same without logs. Why? Because there are some papers that don't take logs and they obtain different results. When we did that, we didn't find really change in our results. The same results that we found were not altered here. Okay, the next thing is, okay, it could be that our results are affected by possible structure breaks in the variables. So we just performed Bayes-Perron tests of unknown multiple structure breaks. Okay, I will show you. And we found, of course, evidence of breaks. Okay, there are many, of course, ways of specifying the tests. Okay, once with trend, once without trend, once you look at the regression without independent variables, with independent variables, and we found really breaks here that accord with some words. For instance, 1967 appears a lot. Okay, 1973. Okay, 82, the war with Lebanon. Okay. In 91, the Gulf War, it is basically, it's not a war that Israel was really involved in it. It was simply getting missiles from Iran, from Iraq. Okay, so back to 1 second. Sorry, 1 second. I'm going back to the. Sorry. Okay. So after we incorporate our structure breaks in the regression, basically you add the structure breaks as dummy variables in the regression. Okay, in the ARDL regression. Okay, our results were not altered, except that now we found that in election years we have reduction in military spending. For instance, here, look here. In election years, you have military spending going down, and it is significant at a 7% level. Okay. Okay. So basically, we got exactly the same results. Okay. The same we got also when we used other methods. Okay, I talked about ARDL, but we can also use single equation co-integration. There are 3 methods. We applied those 3 methods and got about the same results. Namely what? Namely that GDP is related positively to military spending. Population is related negatively. The Arab threat is related positively, like when Arabs increase their military spending, also Israel increases. And we have some, as I said, we have some indication that also elections, at years of election, you have a reduction of it's weak evidence. Okay, you can see 9%, 10% here. Okay, that in election years you reduce your spending, and I have to summarize now. Okay, basically what I said now. Okay, summarized, but we got across the board, basically across all the methods that we applied, we found that the higher the GDP, the higher the military spending. We found an inverse relationship between population size and military spending. Israel is in arms race with our Arab neighbors. Turkey and Iran are not a factor. Okay, and in years of wars and major operations, military operations, we have a rise in military spending and some weak evidence of declining military spending in election years. That's it. Thank you very much. So, Roland, if you have some thoughts on it, now it is the time, even though we are a little, after the time. But
this was, someone said I was forewarned, but not forearmed. Now, in hindsight, I was thinking it was good for me, and hopefully for somebody else to find out what IRDL stands for, and to see, which I have been seeing for a time, because I must admit, even though I was in business and then I never talked about econometrics, accounting and leadership and things like that. Here in Mannheim, we have the European Center of Economic Research, ZEW, Zentrum für Europäische Wirtschaftsforschung. And I love to go there, and I find that they are also researching not into this. I think this is unique, talking about military threats and connecting it. But the statistical evidence on indicators which are not monetary indicators is something which always intrigues me, how you can get the threat indicator, or like the lady I mentioned before, the COVID reaction indicators, how you can get this into an econometric analysis. It's just fascinating. I love it. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
But the experts will know a little more. William is is the man to talk now, I think.
Okay, William.
Oh, I don't know. Yeah, getting that type of thing in is difficult, but yeah, I don't know that I have a whole lot of thoughts, I'm afraid.
Okay, I do have a comment though.
Yeah.
What I found interesting when you talked about Iran and Turkey.
Yeah.
And you were saying it wasn't correlated, you know, with their increase in spending to Israel's.
Yes.
You know, when I think about it, you know, and maybe I'm being very simplistic, historically, it's always been looked at is those countries that border Israel as a direct threats. And where you have Iran and Turkey, they're not, you know, immediate borders.
Right.
And then the second factor is that both Iran and Turkey, they have been engaged with other partners, other players out there. How would that parallel, you know, to their spending to Iraq, you know, if we look historically or
we don't
Turkey?
We talk about like the Israeli reaction of their military spending, not the opposite. So if Iran maybe spend more on military, then it might be that Israel feels the threat more. So they have to react by maybe increasing their spending.
Yeah, but the biggest change I see, and I know you're well aware of it, is, you know, we're looking at traditional military spending.
Right.
But it's non-country players that are having, you know, at least it's believed, the biggest impact and the future impact on the security of a country. So what other alternate spendings are, you know, being employed that, you know, maybe have more bang for the buck than the traditional spending? And how that would, you know, affect.
Yeah, I can give you like one example of how Israel may be trying to react to threats from Iran. I mean, one of the threats that Israel sees is maybe long-range missiles that can that can reach here. Since Israel, of course, had in the 1991 in the Gulf War missiles from Iran, from Iraq, sorry, from Iraq. So maybe Israel now have to develop like systems to defend against such a threat.
Yeah, well, which they have.
Of course, Israel developed something to react to Palestinian missiles from Gaza, and it works very well. But I mean, also they have. I know that they are developing some methods of course for long-range missiles coming from Iran or from Iraq or from elsewhere.
Yeah, it's very complex because you're almost having to defend yourself on several different fronts and through varied methods in order to protect yourself. But thank you, it's fascinating, really.
Any other thoughts, comments? Okay, guys.
We have been invited by Maya to go to the plenary. We go to the plenary.
Okay.
But one just remark, that is the official figures of the government. How about cyber war expenditures, which may not be in the budget?
Yeah, you are very right. I mean, we talk about direct outlays. Of course, there are like in Israel, of course, every house has to have like a shelter. This is, you can think of this as also some sort of military spending, or we have a mandatory military service. So the waste of this can be also seen as sort of wasting resources, but this is not taken into account.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Abur.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Stevie. Thank you very much for everybody that participated in this fruitful session. And we look forward to see each other maybe in the future.